In the ancient, sun-baked heart of first-century Judea, words were a heavy currency. For the scribes, the Pharisees, and the teachers of the law, words were the stones with which they built unscalable walls. The Torah, beautiful and divine in its origin, had been wrapped in thousands of additional rules, regulations, and commentaries. Religion had become a burden, a yoke of iron that rested heavily on the shoulders of the common people. The teachers of the day spoke with the authority of tradition, quoting rabbis who quoted other rabbis, endlessly debating the minutiae of the Sabbath and ritual purity. Their words were rigid, sharp, and entirely devoid of life. Into this arid spiritual landscape stepped a carpenter from the obscure northern village of Nazareth. His name was Jesus. He carried no scrolls of pedigree. He held no official office in the great temple of Jerusalem. He possessed no wealth, no political backing, and no earthly army. Yet when he opened his mouth, the atmosphere of the earth itself seemed to shift. He possessed something that completely confounded the religious elite and hopelessly captivated the broken masses. He spoke with exousia, a Greek word meaning absolute, unmistakable authority. But this was an authority unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. It was not the coercive authority of the Roman Empire, enforced by the edge of a gladius, nor was it the condemning authority of the Pharisees, enforced by guilt and exclusion. This was an authority inextricably bound to profound, unmerited grace. His words did not merely instruct, they created. They did not merely judge, they healed. This story traces the journey of a man who encounters the breathtaking collision of supreme power and infinite tenderness in the voice of the Son of Man. Elias was a man of the parchment. As a respected scribe in the Sanhedrin, his life was circumscribed by the scent of old leather, the scratching of reed pens, and the endless debates within the stone walls of Jerusalem. His mind was a vast library of the law. If a man walked too many steps on the Sabbath, Elias could cite exactly which tradition he had broken. If a woman dropped a clay pot near a burial site, Elias could declare it unclean with a single authoritative breath. But Elias was also a man who was quietly, secretly dying of thirst. The religion he had dedicated his life to felt like chewing on dry sand. He was righteous, yes, but he was empty. Rumors began to drift southward from the region of Galilee, like the scent of rain before a storm. Whispers of a rabbi who healed the sick, who gave sight to the blind, and who taught not like the scribes, but as one who had direct communion with the Almighty. The Sanhedrin was nervous. He is a deceiver, they argued, a radical leading the uneducated astray. Elias was tasked with investigating. He packed a small travel bag, strapped on his leather sandals, and began the long journey north toward the Sea of Galilee. He intended to listen, to take notes, to trap this Messiah in a theological error, and to return to Jerusalem with the evidence needed to silence him. Elias believed that no man could challenge the established authority of the temple. He did not know that he was walking directly into the presence of the Word made flesh. Elias arrived in the fishing village of Capernaum on a Friday evening, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the waters of the Galilee in bruised purples and burnt oranges. The next morning, he attended the local synagogue. The room was packed, suffocatingly hot, smelling of salt, sweat, and anticipation. Jesus of Nazareth was invited to read. Elias stood in the back, his arms crossed, his critical mind sharp and ready. Jesus stood up, unrolled the scroll of the prophet Isaiah, and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Jesus rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. Every eye in the synagogue was fastened on him. The silence was absolute. Elias waited for the standard commentary, a long, dry exposition on when this distant, mythological future might arrive. Instead, Jesus spoke a single, earth-shattering sentence. "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Elias felt a chill run down his spine. The audacity, the sheer, unvarnished claim to divinity. But before Elias could formulate his objection, a commotion erupted. A man in the corner, tormented by an impure spirit, began to scream. "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." The synagogue erupted in panic. Men recoiled. Scribes murmured in fear. Elias braced himself, expecting the rabbi to flee or begin a long, complex ritual of exorcism involving roots and incantations, as was the custom. Jesus did neither. He did not raise his voice to a hysterical shout. He did not perform a theatrical ritual. He simply locked eyes with the tormented man, and with calm, terrifying authority, he spoke into the chaos. "Be quiet and come out of him." The words were not a request. They were an eviction notice from the creator of the universe. The demon shrieked, threw the man to the ground, and departed. The man lay there, panting, weeping, fully restored and in his right mind. The crowd was stunned. Elias dropped his reed pen. The murmurs rippled through the room, echoing Elias's own internal shock. What is this teaching? With authority and power, he gives orders to impure spirits, and they come out. Here was authority, but it was used entirely to dispense grace. The word was a weapon, yes, but a weapon used exclusively against the darkness that bound a human soul, not against the human himself. Weeks turned into a month. Elias did not return to Jerusalem. He could not. He was tethered to this Jesus, following him at a distance, mingling with the crowds of fishermen, tax collectors, prostitutes, and lepers. The very people Elias had spent his life avoiding were the ones flocking to the Nazarene. One morning, the crowds grew so large that Jesus climbed a hillside near the lake to teach them. Elias found a spot near a rock outcropping, sitting among the commoners, his expensive Pharisaical robes dusty and stained. Jesus sat down, opened his mouth, and delivered what history would remember as the Sermon on the Mount. Elias listened, his theological frameworks being dismantled sentence by sentence. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." Jesus then did something that terrified Elias. He took the law of Moses, the bedrock of Elias's universe, and elevated it beyond mere external compliance, driving it straight into the human heart. "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder.' But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment." 6 times Jesus used this formula. "You have heard that it was said, but I say to you." Elias realized the profound implication. Jesus was not citing older rabbis to validate his points. He was not debating interpretation. He was claiming authorship of the law itself. He was speaking as the lawgiver. It was an assertion of absolute sovereignty. Yet interspersed with this towering, impossible standard of righteousness were words of such intimate grace that Elias found tears welling in his eyes. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." The scribes laid heavy burdens on people. Jesus offered to carry the burden for them. His authority was not used to crush the weak, but to shield them. Elias looked around at the faces of the crowd. They were not cowering in fear, as they did before the Pharisees. They were weeping with relief. They were being washed by words that were simultaneously a roaring lion and a gentle lamb. Elias was eventually recalled to Jerusalem. The Sanhedrin was furious at his delay and his lack of actionable intelligence. They had devised their own plan to trap the Nazarene, who had recently arrived in the city for the Feast of Tabernacles. It was early morning in the temple courts. Elias stood among his colleagues, his heart heavy with dread. They had dragged a woman before Jesus, a woman caught in the very act of adultery. She was thrown onto the cold stone pavement, disheveled, weeping, terrified. The penalty under the law of Moses was death by stoning. The Pharisees, their faces twisted with religious zeal and political malice, challenged Jesus. "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" It was the perfect lethal trap. If Jesus said, "Let her go," he would be openly violating the law of Moses, losing his credibility and providing grounds for his arrest as a heretic. If he said, "Stone her," he would violate Roman law, which reserved capital punishment for the state, and destroy his reputation as a teacher of mercy and grace. Elias held his breath. He wanted to shout, to warn Jesus, but he was paralyzed. Jesus did not argue. He did not panic. He simply bent down and began to write in the dust of the temple floor with his finger. The loud, demanding voices of the accusers echoed off the colonnades, but Jesus let them stew in the silence. Finally, he straightened up. He looked at the angry mob, men holding heavy, jagged stones in their white-knuckled hands. With the calm, penetrating authority that pierced bone and marrow, Jesus spoke. "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Then he stooped back down and continued writing. Elias felt the words hit him like a physical blow. It was a masterclass in divine wisdom. Jesus had upheld the law. He agreed that sin required judgment, but he immediately disqualified the judges. He turned the piercing light of the law away from the broken woman and aimed it directly into the dark, hypocritical hearts of the religious elite. Elias looked at his own hands. They were trembling. He heard a thud, then another. Beginning with the older men, who had the most years to accumulate their secret sins, the Pharisees dropped their stones. One by one, they turned and walked away, their pride shattered by a single sentence of truth. Elias backed away into the shadows, unable to leave, unable to stay. Only Jesus and the woman were left. Jesus stood up and looked at her. "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." Elias wept in the shadows of the pillars. In those words, he witnessed the perfect union of absolute authority and boundless grace. Only the one who was truly without sin had the authority to pick up the stone. Jesus alone had the right to condemn her, but in his grace, he chose to forgive her, while still commanding her to walk in righteousness. The turning point for Elias, the moment the final remnants of his legalistic pride crumbled into dust, happened weeks later near the Sea of Galilee. He had abandoned his post in Jerusalem. He was now a silent follower, desperate for every word that fell from the Master's lips. One evening, Jesus and his disciples boarded a fishing boat to cross to the other side of the lake. Elias managed to secure passage on a smaller, trailing vessel. As night fell, a furious squall came down on the lake. The Sea of Galilee, sitting in a deep basin, was notorious for sudden, violent storms. But this was a tempest of unnatural ferocity. Waves the size of small hills crashed over the boats. The howling wind sounded like the screaming of demons. The experienced fishermen were in a panic, bailing water, shouting over the roar, convinced they were about to drown. Elias clung to the mast of his small boat, staring through the driving rain at the larger vessel ahead. Through the flashes of lightning, he saw an unbelievable sight. Jesus was asleep in the stern, resting on a cushion. The disciples woke him, screaming, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Jesus awoke. He did not look at the storm with fear. He looked at it with the annoyance of a master whose house is in disorder. He stood up on the swaying deck, holding his hand out to the raging sky and the boiling sea. He did not pray for the storm to stop. He did not ask God to intervene. He commanded creation. "Quiet. Be still." The words were spoken in Aramaic. "Shalom. Be muzzled." The response of nature was instantaneous and absolute. The wind did not gradually die down. It ceased to exist. The waves did not slowly subside. They flattened into glass in a fraction of a second. The sudden silence was louder than the roaring storm had been. In the eerie calm, Jesus turned to his terrified friends. "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" From his boat, Elias fell to his knees in the pooling water on the deck. The men around him were whispering in sheer, unadulterated terror. "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Elias knew the answer. The words that had just muzzled the sea were the exact same words that had spoken the oceans into existence at the dawn of time. The authority of Jesus was not merely theological, nor was it limited to morality or demonic spirits. His authority was cosmic. He was the author of the story, writing himself into the pages. Yet he used this terrifying, earth-shattering power not to destroy mankind, but to save a boat full of doubting, panicking friends. His power was infinite. His grace was equally boundless. Years passed. The religious leaders in Jerusalem, terrified of an authority they could not control and a grace they could not comprehend, eventually conspired with Rome to have the carpenter from Nazareth crucified. Elias was there. He watched the Lord of Glory hang on a rough wooden cross. Even in his dying breath, Jesus' words were laced with an impossible, agonizing grace. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And finally, the ultimate word of triumph, a single Greek word that echoed through the corridors of eternity. Tetelestai. It is finished. But the grave could not hold the author of life. The resurrection proved that his words were not just beautiful philosophies, they were the very foundation of reality. Now, Elias sits as an old man in a small room in Ephesus. His eyesight is failing, and his hands tremble as he holds a reed pen. The Roman Empire is beginning to fracture, its mighty legions proving powerless against time and decay. The great temple in Jerusalem has been reduced to rubble by the Romans, its rituals and rigid laws buried under ash and stone. But the words of the Nazarene remain. Elias dips his pen into the ink. He writes letters to the new fledgling communities of believers spreading across the known world. He tells them of the storm, of the demoniac, of the woman in the dust, of the hillside teachings. He wants them to know that the world will offer them many voices of authority, kings who demand their allegiance, philosophers who demand their intellect, and legalists who demand their perfection. These earthly authorities will rule through fear, manipulation, and force. They will crush the broken to elevate themselves. But do not listen to them, Elias writes, a smile touching his weathered face. Listen to the word, for I have seen him. I have heard him speak. The authority of Jesus Christ was the most disruptive force in human history precisely because it was entirely surrendered to love. He had the power to summon legions of angels to destroy his enemies, yet he used his breath to heal the sick, forgive the sinner, and bless the poor. His words are a double-edged sword that cuts away our pride, our self-righteousness, and our illusions of control. But they are also the balm of Gilead, binding up our deepest wounds and whispering life into our deadened souls. To encounter the words of Jesus is to stand at the terrifying, beautiful intersection of unyielding truth and unconditional love. It is to be stripped bare by his absolute authority, only to find yourself instantly clothed in his scandalous grace. And for those who have ears to hear, the echo of his voice continues to silence the storms of this world, softly calling out across the centuries. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away.